Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. This week's podcast, we are going to focus on the so-called chronicler, which includes 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah. It is often suggested that 1st and 2 Chronicles, at least, is a restatement of the basic Israelite story told from a slightly different perspective. To a degree, that is true. But from another angle, that does not account for the significant differences between the two accounts. Of course, the main account is narrated in Joshua through 2 Kings. In that material, the Israelite monarchy is accented. In 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, both of them trace the rise and fall of the Israelite monarchy. Of course, 1st and 2nd Chronicles treats the Israelite monarchy as well. But when we compare the two narratives, the difference in outlook is pronounced. Perhaps that is nowhere more evident than in the way that the figure of Saul is treated in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Not only does Saul play a prominent role in 1 Samuel, arguably he is one of the most dominant figures. In great detail, we are given a story that begins with Saul out looking for his father's lost livestock, which leads him to consult the prophet Samuel, who proceeds to anoint Saul as Israel's king at God's behest. There are signs that confirm that Saul's anointment was confirmed by divine orders. There is no question that the Lord chose Saul. He was all but flabbergasted that this had happened. God did this even though both the deity and Samuel the prophet were upset that Israel was demanding a king, quote unquote, like all the other nations. The very opposite of the sort of the king God had in mind for Israel. Nevertheless, though initially reluctant, Saul accepted the job. Unfortunately, his first misstep put him on the outs with the same God who had initially chosen him. However, even after David had been anointed to replace Saul, Saul remained king until his death at the hand of the Philistines. That's in 1 Samuel 31. Saul's first mistakes and his checkered history with David are the main thrust of the narrative found in 1 Samuel 8 through 1 Samuel 31. Though not a sympathetic character, Saul was certainly a main character in this portion of the biblical story. Saul does not fare as well in Chronicles. In that story, he is barely mentioned, and when he is in the narrator's sights, he is presented in exclusively negative terms. The narrator is quite aware that Saul had a role in Israel's past. Saul's kingdom, for example, is mentioned in 1 Chronicles 12, verse 24. Twice there are references to the days of Saul. That's in 1 Chronicles 5, verse 10, and chapter 13, verse 3. Once, the house of Saul, meaning his dynasty, is cited. That's in 1 Chronicles 12, verse 30. Yet that is a bare bones treatment. Very little flesh is placed on those bones. It is as though Israel's monarchy began with David. Curiously, in 1 Chronicles, the narrative in which Saul is a character begins with his being defeated by the Philistines. That's in 1 Chronicles chapter 10, verse 1. In the process of Israel's absorbing this defeat, Saul fell out at the hand of Philistine archers. Before this, however, 3 of Saul's sons were killed in the battle, including the famous Jonathan, or at least he's famous in 1 Samuel. That's in verse 2 of chapter 10. In this situation, A wounded Saul desperately asked his armor-bearer to finish him off so that he could avoid the humiliation the Philistines, here called derisively the uncircumcised, were sure to inflict on him. The armor-bearer was afraid to comply with Saul's orders, so Saul took matters into his own hands and committed suicide by falling on his own sword. That's in verses 3 and 4 of chapter 10. Apparently traumatized by this move on Saul's part, his armor-bearer then took his own life in verse 5. The narrative makes sure that we realize that this was the ultimate death of the house of Saul in verse 6. What had happened to Saul and his 3 sons completely discouraged his troops, so they abandoned the Israelite cities they were protecting. Subsequently, the Philistines occupied these cities. That's in verse 7 of chapter 10. On the very next day, when the Philistines came to strip the fallen troops of anything valuable, they found the corpses of Saul and his 3 sons. That's in verse 10. That's in verse 8 of chapter 10. They stripped Saul of his armor, decapitated him, and sent messengers throughout Philistia to carry the good news to their idols and to the Philistine population. That's in verse 9 of chapter 10. The Philistines also put Saul's armor in the temple of their gods and fastened his head onto a place in the temple of Dagon, a high Philistine deity. That's in verse 10. Clearly, from a Philistine perspective, not only had they won a resounding military victory, but they had, in addition, demonstrated that their gods had aided them. Humiliation on this scale could not be allowed to stand. When Israelites from Jabesh-Gilead heard what had happened to Saul and his sons, certain valiant men arose and managed to find Saul's remains and those of his 3 dead sons. These remains were brought to Jabesh and were buried under an oak. This prompted a 7-day fast, obviously indicative of a serious bout of mourning. That's in verses 11 to 12 of chapter 10. At the conclusion of this brief description of Saul's loss to the Philistines and of the king's death along with that of his 3 sons, the first Chronicles narrator passes judgment. We learn that Saul died for his unfaithfulness. That's in verse 13. He had been unfaithful on 2 counts. 1, he had not kept the commandment of the Lord, which command was not specified. 2, he had consulted with a medium seeking guidance. This was expressly forbidden to Israelites. For these reasons, the Lord slew Saul, and in the process handed over his kingdom to David, the son of Jesse. That's in verses 13 through 14 of chapter 10. Except for a couple of references that mention a past when Saul was king, that is the extent of the Saul story in 1 Chronicles. Of course, there is no way of knowing whether the person who wrote this material had access to the much more extensive account of Saul found in 1 Samuel. If the author did have that material, he had excessively abbreviated it, leaving out anything positive about Saul. Nothing is said about his being selected by God, his being anointed by Samuel, his encountering 3 signs indicating divine approval, and no reporting of the positive episode when Saul defeated Nahash, the Ammonite king. The gist of the defeat that the Philistines inflicted on Saul, including his death by suicide, his armor-bearer's suicide, and the death of his 3 sons, is all that 1 Chronicles presents. That episode was at the very end of the story of Saul, according to 1 Samuel. That's in 1 Samuel 31. Regardless of what source material the author of 1 Chronicles had at his disposal, and here I'm assuming a male author, only the most negative details about Saul are related. Not one single positive statement about Saul is to be found anywhere in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Saul was barely a footnote in Israelite history, according to 1st Chronicles. There is no description about how he became king. There are no pluses to his rule. In fact, in 1st Chronicles 11:2, that is chapter 11, verse 2, we learn that it was David who was Israel's true leader and the man that the Lord designated to be, quote, shepherd of my people, end of quote, and a, quote, unquote, prince of my people. Saul apparently only stood in David's way. The author of 1 Chronicles dispatches Saul and his kingship in a single chapter, citing only bad news. Indeed, all of Israel's elders went to Hebron to make a covenant with David so that he could be the Israelite king. The elders then anointed David king over Israel. They did this, quote-unquote, before the Lord, and, quote-unquote, according to the word of the Lord by Samuel. This last reference is curious. Unless it refers to Samuel's originally anointing David as king, as presented, for example, in 1 Samuel 16, it involves a chronology problem. In 1 Samuel, the prophet Samuel died before Saul died, and before David had become king. That's in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, verse 3. From 1 Chronicles 11 and on, the text concentrates on David. David, in fact, is featured throughout the rest of 1 Chronicles. Clearly, the person or persons who were responsible for 1 Chronicles maximized David and his impact on Israel. Conversely, Saul was hardly worth mentioning. Saul comes close to being an afterthought. The word on the street is that 1st and 2nd Chronicles is seldom read from cover to cover for a couple of reasons. One is that the first 9 chapters contains a massive genealogy, and no modern people like that. 2 is that we already know Israel's story from 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. However, the way Saul is depicted in Chronicles should make us realize that the 2 stories are radically different. Saul is featured beginning in chapter 9 of 1 Samuel, and he plays a significant role until his death in chapter 31. As well, he is not maximally evil. One could even make a case that his job was all but impossible since he was caught in the crossfire between the people on one side and God and Samuel the prophet on the other. God had already told the people through Samuel that the kingship would be a disaster. This was just before God selected Saul to be the first king. That's in 1 Samuel 8. The perspective on Israel is fundamentally different in Samuel and Kings. At the very least, the manner in which Saul's story is told should make us realize that. Also, the fact that such different accounts were later canonized to become scripture should make us aware of the extreme variety of biblical material. It does not present one perspective on Israel or God's relationship to it. We have to do much more work about how to reconcile these wildly differing stories. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com, and it has now been reconstructed. You can find all of these podcasts right there, and you could listen to them just by going to the website. Also, let me know what your email is so that I'll have a way to contact you when we are ready for the mini courses. As well, if you have a question that you'd like me to address in a subsequent question and answer time, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.